4 years into the war in Ukraine, and it's the sky over Moscow that turned black. The reason isn't fire from a power plant or a natural disaster. Instead, Ukrainian drones have reached all the way to the Russian capital and struck the city's largest oil refinery. And the fact that Ukraine has managed to consistently reach Russia is basically all you need to know about how the war is going. Russia is being broken. But how did we go from an invasion that was supposed to last for 3 days into a full-blown war where Russian President Vladimir Putin is slowly losing control over his country? There's no single answer here, but instead a combination of factors. So let's start with the scale of what we're seeing in 2026, and to do that, we need to rewind to the first weeks. When the invasion began in February 2022, Russia moved fast, and it moved everywhere. Armored columns poured in from Belarus toward Kyiv, out of Crimea into the south and across the eastern border, swallowing huge stretches of Ukraine in a matter of days. By late March 2022, barely a month into the war, Russia controlled more Ukrainian territory than it ever would again in 4.5 years. Then came the autumn of 2022, and the map snapped back violently in Ukraine's favor. In early September, Ukraine launched its Kharkiv counter-offensive, and it was breathtaking. Kyiv's forces recaptured roughly 6,000 square kilometers in a matter of days, advancing at an average pace of around 7,400 meters a day. Hold that number in your head, because it's going to matter in a moment. The Center for Strategic and International Studies would later rank that operation among the most effective military offensives in all of modern warfare. 2 months later, in November 2022, Ukraine forced the Russians to abandon the city of Kherson, the only regional capital Moscow had managed to capture in the entire invasion. In the span of a single autumn, Ukraine had erased months of Russian gains and shattered the myth that the Russian army was an unstoppable machine. After that, the war congealed. Between January and September 2023, Russian forces took only about 465 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory, which was almost nothing. The one prize that year was Bakhmut, a small eastern city that took the better part of 10 months and tens of thousands of casualties to capture. And Russia finally took it in May 2023, only after reducing it to rubble. The year 2024 was arguably more pivotal for Russia, where its forces took about 3,600 square kilometers. On paper, that sounds like a serious offensive. But even this so-called peak meant that Russia was advancing only about 50 meters a day. Particularly important was the city of Pokrovsk, a logistics target in Donetsk, where Russia advanced just under 50 kilometers in nearly 2 years of fighting. This was never a blitzkrieg. It was a glacier of men in shells creeping forward over the bodies it left behind. And 2025 repeated the slow but steady pattern. We gained somewhere around 4,300 square kilometers. But for all of that, Russia failed to push more than about 40 kilometers forward in any single direction in the entire year. And then 2026 happened. At the start of this year, the Russian advance basically hit a wall. The daily rate of Russian gains collapsed to about 2.9 square kilometers a day across the first 4 months of 2026, down from 9.76 square kilometers a day over the same period a year earlier. And in April 2026, Russia posted a net loss of territory, surrendering about 116 square kilometers, its first total loss since August 2024 and the Kursk invasion. Overall, between February and May of this year, Russian forces captured just 164 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. In the same window last year, Russia took 1,151 square kilometers. Now, there's usually a rhythm to Russia's war. The offensive tends to sag in late winter and early spring when the ground is bad and the weather is worse, before picking back up around May. Russian commanders count on that spring resurgence. In 2026, that resurgence didn't come. Throughout June, there's been no sign of Russian advances resuming across the front in any meaningful way. The seasonal engine that was supposed to restart the offensive has sputtered, and the reason isn't the mud, it's the drones. Walk up to the front line today and you'll see what that means in practice. Russian commanders are still doing what they've always done, ordering small groups of soldiers forward to probe Ukrainian lines, hunting for a gap, a weak seam, a tied unit. But they're sending those men into a battlefield that's now saturated with drones. Quadcopters loiter overhead. Fiber optic FPVs slip through the trees. Reconnaissance birds feed coordinates back in real time. What used to be a calculated infantry assault is now very often a death sentence carried out one squad at a time. And here's the brutal arithmetic for Moscow. The very tactic that once delivered slow, steady gains now mostly delivers casualties. And this is where the deeper shift comes in, the one that goes beyond any single map or any single month. In short, robotification has made troop numbers far less important than they used to be, and that's changed the entire fortunes of the war for Kyiv. Think about what that actually means. For generations, the brutal math of land war favored whoever could field more bodies. Russia banked everything on that. But if you can fight with 10,000 or 20,000 skilled drone operators instead of hundreds of thousands of men sitting in trenches, then the body count stops being the be-all and end-all. And the main number that shows why is precisely the rate at which Russia has been losing troops. While the overall numbers are certainly harrowing, the bigger indicator is the trend. And according to Ukrainian officials, Russia has been losing more men on the battlefield than it can recruit to replace them throughout the entire 2026. The actual recruitment figures back this up. Russia budget data indicate that Moscow signed up 71,216 men in the first quarter of 2026. Over the same period a year earlier, that number was 89,601. So Russia is recruiting noticeably fewer men than it was a year ago, at exactly the moment when Ukraine is taking back more territory. So how is Ukraine actually doing this? According to the KSC Institute, Ukraine's production of FPV drones exploded from just 3,000 to 5,000 units a year in 2022 to roughly 3 million in 2025, and by early 2026, its defense industry had the capacity to turn out more than 8 million of them annually. Per working-age person, Ukraine in 2026 produces somewhere between 6 and 9 times as many drones as Russia does. Where Ukraine once had to burn a Patriot interceptor worth millions of dollars to knock down a cheap incoming drone, it now fields its own interceptor drones like the Sting at around $2,000 apiece. And by early 2026, Ukrainian firms were producing as many as 1,000 of those interceptors every single day. A country that was supposed to be outproduced into submission is now innovating the invader at a fraction of the cost. The campaign that's strangling Russia isn't built around the headline-grabbing strikes on Moscow alone. The real workhorse is what Ukrainians call the middle range, a range of roughly 150 kilometers beyond the front line. That's the band where Ukraine has been concentrating for drone and missile strikes, because at that depth, you're hitting the logistics of the Russian army, its supply convoys, its fuel, its ammunition. Nowhere is this clearer than along the land corridor to Crimea. Since May, hundreds of Ukrainian drones of every type have been flying toward that corridor, which is the crucial overland route Russia uses to resupply the peninsula it annexed back in 2014, and to sustain the troops dug in along the southern front. The R280 highway is the smooth, fast artery that's supposed to keep all of that flowing. Ukraine has turned it into a shooting gallery. So Russian troops now wait longer for their fuel and ammunition to arrive. Their logistics units have been forced to switch to smaller, less conspicuous trucks, or to crawl along rough village back roads instead of using the fast highway, because anything moving on the R280 risks a drone. Artem Bielyankov, who is the chief of the 412th Nemesis Drone Brigade, described the operation as painful for the Russian military. And honestly, that's the more dangerous kind of pressure. It's not a single knockout blow, but a constant grinding tax on everything Russia tries to move. Now, you might expect Russia to simply copy what Ukraine is doing. After all, the Russians have their own elite drone unit called Rubicon, which has built up a fearsome reputation in certain sectors. But where Ukraine has expanded its drone and missile strikes to isolate Russian forces and sever their supply chains, Rubicon has failed to adopt the same scale. The assessment was that trying to expand the unit meant that Russia was overreaching. By doubling the number of drone operators, the unit drastically lowered its entrance requirements and reduced operator training. The unit also started recruiting from the same pool as the frontline does, potentially reducing the available manpower Russia has on the ground, and yet not even providing the same level of training as before. But before we get into the real reason why drone operations are stalling, make sure to subscribe to The Military Show. We post daily videos that are all about global geopolitics, helping you get a full picture of the war and all the circumstances surrounding it. Back to Russia's drone industry. The underlying issue is that the entire military-industrial complex is failing. The reason for this is that years of war spending have pushed the economy to record-low unemployment. This might sound great until you realize what it means for a war machine. When almost everyone already has a job, it becomes very hard to pull skilled workers into cutting-edge fields like drone production. Outside of unmanned systems and long-range weapons, the areas where Russia is pouring in the most resources, production has largely stagnated. In fact, a Reuters report from February suggested the country needed over 2.3 million more workers. And even in the priority sectors, where output has genuinely increased, the military industry has plateaued. That's despite the country funneling 40% of the government budget into the military and national defense and related sectors, figures that haven't been seen in decades. So what does the man at the top make of all of this? By some accounts, Putin and his inner circle have been reduced to insisting that Russia still holds the upper hand. But according to two former senior Kremlin officials, Putin now spends most of his time micromanaging the war effort itself, and he receives briefings from his top commander, Valery Gerasimov, sometimes as often as twice a day. And according to those same former officials, Putin genuinely believes the war is only a question of time. But there's a wicked dynamic here. For the past 2 decades of his being in power, Putin has dismantled most governmental checks for his rule, putting people who are loyal to him in vital positions in the military, intelligence, and government services. But Putin is also still under the influence of the military, considering he was instrumental in creating it. And yet, those same intelligence services failed to report actual data when it came to Ukraine's response to the special military operation. And despite that, Putin believes them anyway and lets them keep doing it. That's because the services know that, for all the power they have, they're not out of reach of Putin's dismantling. So they feed wrong information and try to hide what's truly going on in the war, both from Putin and the general public. And every so often, that carefully managed bubble cracks in public. In early June, during a national holiday, Putin met with a group of servicemen inside the Kremlin. These soldiers kept pressing him on the same question: when exactly would Russia finally develop an answer to Elon Musk's Starlink? Ukraine uses that satellite network to guide its attack drones along the front line, and the men fighting on the ground can feel the difference it makes. Putin insisted that Russia had already developed and fielded its own answer to Starlink. He noted that it just needs time to scale up. But at this point, only 16 units had been launched. The most generous estimate of when the system, known as Rasvet, would cover the country is 2030. That implies that the system won't be fully operational for 4 more years, while the war drags on and Ukraine uses the original Starlink to its full potential. Instead of focusing on Starlink, Putin launched into a long complaint about how Moscow was up against the collective might of NATO, a rant that wandered through historical references to Napoleon and Hitler before landing on a vague reassurance that Russia has things the enemy doesn't, and that it'll be bigger and better in the end. That's the sound of a leadership that's run out of real answers and is reaching for the comfort of old myths. Of course, none of this means Russia is beaten, or that the war is about to end, or that Ukraine is somehow winning easily. Russia retains a very real, very dangerous capacity to inflict terrible damage, and we owe it to the people living under those bombs to be honest about that. Because while Ukraine has seized the initiative in the drone war, Russian jets have been hammering Ukrainian positions with gliding bombs in record numbers. These are Soviet-era bombs fitted with cheap guidance kits and pop-out wings, and they've been relentlessly pounding Ukrainian dugouts, tree lines, and apartment buildings. Part of why they're so effective comes down to a persistent shortage of anti-aircraft systems. Because Ukraine can't reliably threaten Russian aircraft, those jets can fly closer to the front before releasing their bombs, which lets them drop these heavy weapons with frightening accuracy. So Russia has been using as many as 5,700 glide bombs per month. Ukraine's response was to double down on jamming, where it developed a system that disrupted the rudimentary navigation system and at least temporarily neutralized them. But the bombs aren't slowing down. Based on the record of 5,700 bombs in January, Russia could produce and deploy around 68,000 to 70,000 glide bombs in 2026, up from around 60,000 in 2025. So the gliding bombs remain a problem that Ukraine hasn't managed to solve. Russia has also been turning its fury on Ukraine cities, so Kyiv has been hit by massive waves of drones and missiles on 3 separate occasions in early summer. And here, Ukraine is still showing that its air force can struggle to deal with ballistic and hypersonic missiles because it simply doesn't have enough of the sophisticated anti-air munitions needed to knock them down. But this intensified pace of attacks on Ukrainian cities could actually be a response to Russia's problems on the battlefield. Since Russia can't make any progress on the ground, it might be trying to push more in the air. And so Ukraine has decided to strike Russia where it hurts: oil. The refinery strike in Moscow that opened this video isn't a one-off stunt. It's the visible tip of a campaign that's been quietly gutting Russia's energy backbone. By an April 2026 New York Times assessment, Ukrainian strikes have knocked out roughly 20% of Russia's refining capacity since early 2024. The plants, taken fully or partly offline, carry a combined capacity above 83 million tons a year, about a quarter of Russia's total, accounting for over 30% of the country's gasoline production and about a quarter of its diesel, according to Reuters. April also saw at least 21 Ukrainian strikes on refineries, terminals, ships, and pipeline stations, the highest monthly total since December, cutting Russian refinery runs to their lowest level in more than 16 years. The damage forced Russia to cut oil production by roughly 300,000 to 400,000 barrels a day from its first quarter levels, the sharpest monthly drop in about 6 years. And Ukraine has gotten smarter about where it aims, increasingly targeting specialized bottlenecks like hydro crackers, where Russia's offline capacity hit 250,000 barrels a day against 50,000 to 60,000 a year earlier, on equipment that needs replacement parts with lead times stretching into months thanks to Western sanctions. The most telling moment came in June, when Russia's own energy ministry admitted for the first time that enemy air attacks had caused supply complications, even as Putin conceded that Russia needed better air defenses. When the Kremlin starts admitting the damage out loud, you know it's real. That's why the talk inside Moscow has started to turn toward mobilization again. But this might even make matters worse. Remember in 2022, after the special military operation no longer seemed like a done deal, Putin announced a partial mobilization, calling up around 300,000 reservists. It resulted in nearly 1 million people leaving the country, most of them never to return. In 2026, the same exodus might happen again, only this time there aren't that many people left. And we need to circle back to the labor shortage from before, as mass mobilization will only mess that up more. And even if Putin were willing to swallow the political risk and the economic damage, a mass mobilization will still hand him the wrong soldiers for the war he's actually fighting. Remember what this war has become. It's no longer decided by hundreds of thousands of men sitting in trenches. It's decided by skilled drone operators, engineers, and technicians. The very kind of highly trained people that a panicked, indiscriminate call-up simply doesn't produce. So let's pull all of this together, because the shape of it matters. Ukraine has taken the two pillars Putin built this war on, overwhelming manpower and untouchable depth, and knocked them both out from under him. The manpower advantage is bleeding away because drones have made bodies less decisive, and because Russia is losing men faster than it can replace them. The safety of Russia's rear is gone because Ukrainian drones now reach all the way to refineries in Moscow. Russia's advance has collapsed to a fraction of last year's pace. Its defense industry has hit a ceiling it can't quickly raise, and its leadership has been reduced to insisting everything is fine while begging for an answer to Starlink it doesn't have. Yes, Russia can still bomb Ukrainian cities and grind forward in the Donbass at a terrible price, but it's spending its strength to hold a losing position while the fundamentals shift further against it every single month. Now, to learn more about the drones that are making the mid-range strategy of Ukraine actually work, check out this video. And make sure to subscribe to the Military Show to keep up with all the news surrounding the war in Ukraine and global geopolitics.